Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Men in My Life by Vivian Gornick, narrated by J. Michael McCullough.
Preface. In school, the teacher held a composition of mine up to the class when I was 8 years old and said, "This little girl is going to be a writer." At home, where Marx, socialism, and the international working class were articles of faith, my mother pressed my upper arm between two fingers and said, "Never forget where you come from." Both events were formative. I grew passionate over writing, and the politicalness of life was never lost on me. In my youth, these twin influences made me suffer. I thought them hopelessly oppositional, and was tormented by the suspicion that ultimately I need choose one way of knowing the world over the other. It was literature that spoke most thrillingly to what I was already beginning to call the human condition. But when social injustice stared me in the face, it was easy enough to trade in emotional nuance for doctrinaire simplicity. So one day it was exciting to say to myself, the only reality is the system. The next, I'd pick up Anna Karenina, and the sole reality of the system would do a slow dissolve. I entered college, and somewhere in my junior year, something interesting happened. A drama of internal anguish that subsumed all else began to unfold. The words anxiety and depression entered my vocabulary. Conflicts I had never before paid attention to became alarming. In no time at all, an unimagined universe of interiority opened before me, one equipped with its own theory, laws, and language, and constituting a worldview that could account for everything. This was strong stuff. Under its influence, both literature and politics began to lose their either-or power over me. I didn't stop reading, and I didn't stop signing petitions, but I no longer felt commanded to choose. Then, before I knew it, it was 1970, and feminism was standing boldly on the horizon, urging me to take in its wisdom. The unlived lives of women began to seem not simply a drama of the psyche, but a crime of historic intent that could be solved only through a movement for social justice. This was an insight that, to every generation of feminists since the Enlightenment, had come like revelation. And like revelation, it lit up a convert's sky, coloring every feature of the human landscape. The kaleidoscope of life had been shaken, and all the familiar pieces now formed a new design, one that illuminated the way we spoke, read, thought, and wrote. Keep looking through that prism, we told ourselves, and we'd have every explanation ever needed. Then, problematically, the design complicated itself once more. Although the rhetoric continued to run high, soon enough 70s feminists came to realize that while they stood united in political analysis, ideology alone could not purge them of the pathological self-doubt that seemed every woman's bitter birthright. For that, another kind of struggle was required, one for which a man, not a woman, supplied the tagline. As Anton Chekhov so memorably put it, "Others made me a slave, but I must squeeze the slave out of myself, drop by drop." Suddenly, literature, politics, and analysis came together, and I began to think more inclusively about the emotional imprisonment of mind and spirit to which all human beings are heir. In the course of analytic time, it became apparent that, with or without the burden of social justice, the effort required to attain any semblance of inner freedom was extraordinary. Great literature, I then realized, is a record not of the achievement, but of the effort. With this insight as my guiding light, I began to interpret the lives and work of women and men alike who had spent their years making literature. But it was in the lives of the men, especially, that one could see what it meant to wrestle with the demons. Here they were, talented, often brilliant, with infinitely more permission to do and be than women had ever known. And they were endlessly dragged about by conflicts they could neither give up nor bring under control. I could not but be moved, by the great and the humble alike, to pity and admiration for those who demonstrated repeatedly that to be and do is not a given. V.S. Naipaul has, very nearly, been consumed by the raging self-hatred that powers his work. George Gissing labored under an equally strong self-loathing that made social exile his natural milieu. Randall Jarrell fed a passion for poetry on the fever of a defensive brashness that drove him, ultimately, into suicidal despair. While Loren Eiseley made anthropologic poetry out of an isolating depression of monumental proportions, Allen Ginsberg became a holy fool, and Debussy, Carver, and Ford licked their sentimentalized wounds in story after story. Then, of course, there are Saul Bellow and Philip Roth, who have each produced brilliance upon brilliance out of an unremitting fury that he was born into a culture that persisted in telling him he had no right to measure up. Theirs is a fiction that for 40 years has screamed, "Don't tell me I don't run things around here." Against, or because of, or in spite of, who knows, such disability, each and every one of these writers has converted neurotic necessity into literary virtue, and achieved work of lasting value that casts light on the time in which it was conceived. If indeed criticism is autobiography, this book, then, is a collection of essays written in appreciation of the working lives of literary men by a woman whose critical faculties have been shaped by a passion for literature, a hard-won knowledge of inborn anxiety, and a compelled devotion to liberationist politics. It is this last, I think, that is most responsible for the perspective vital to the making of these essays. The reawakening in my late youth of the centuries-long struggle for women's rights clarified the intimate relation between literature, emotional damage, and social history, made evident to me the organic nature of all that is meant by the word culture. It is my great hope that the reader will experience the development of this perspective as I have, as an enrichment of the writing and reading experience. George Gissing, a neurotic for our times. One of the great neurotics among 19th-century English urban novelists is George Gissing, a writer whose damaged ego forced him into an isolation of his own making, from which, paradoxically, came books of immense social intelligence, motivated by the keenest of psychological insights. These insights were the reward of a literary man whose private torments had the great good luck to mesh with a world of realities only too happy to mirror his troubled soul. Gissing's 22 novels, invariably set in the misery brought on by the Victorian caste system, namely the unhappiness meted out to those born with brains and temperament, but neither money nor connection, are nearly all riddled through with the entrenched melancholy of a protagonist bent on nursing a lifelong sense of deprivation. No one could brood as profitably as he on the failings of a system that regularly drove men and women of merit into the emotional incapacity that ensures spiritual isolation. We know this character. He speaks to us, His angry, brilliant projections remind us of the intimate relation between neurosis and actuality, exactly as we might experience it. Born in Exile is the most openly autobiographical of Gissing's novels. Here, he comes closest to acknowledging that the system alone cannot really be held responsible for the protagonist's defeated life. An impoverished man of 30, intellectually superior, living alone in lodgings, boiling over with misanthropic unhappiness. Godwin Peak thinks he is a prickly misfit because society will not permit him to prosper. On the other hand, it is clearly because he is so prickly that he cannot gain the affection of those who might help him on his way. On vacation in Exeter, Godwin meets the conservative, well-to-do family of an old classmate. The father is a somewhat poetic man, anxious to square religion with the new findings of science. This is the 1880s. And, attracted to these people, especially to the daughter, Godwin finds himself pretending to study for the ministry in order, he tells them, to achieve just such a rapprochement. He is, of course, lying. His friends know him as the most contemptuous of atheists. But craving admission to this world, he feels justified in practicing the deception. When he is found out, he stands disgraced. He and the daughter had fallen in love, but now she refuses to marry him, as it will mean cutting herself off from all she has ever known. Godwin goes abroad to regain his mental health, only to die conveniently in Vienna. The strength of the novel lies in the sophisticated probing of self and world that goes on inside the protagonist. In his panic, Godwin obsesses over his predicament, alternately condemning and justifying his own behavior. But as his emotional reasoning comes clear, he sees that he has always been driven to undo himself. At the very last, he confides to the high-minded woman he has won and lost. My strongest emotions seem to be absorbed in revolt. For once that I feel tenderly, I have 100 fierce, resentful, tempestuous moods. To be suave and smiling in common intercourse costs me an effort. I have to act the part, and this habit makes me skeptical whenever I am really prompted to gentleness. Now we've come to the heart of the matter. For Godwin Peak, the price of the world is internal exile, a circumstance that nourishes doubt and suspicion at a high level. If ever he is made welcome in genteel society, it is certain to be only because society doesn't know him for who and what he really is. It entertains a fantasy that is destined to be sabotaged by our protagonist himself, if necessary. It is this conviction of inescapable outsiderness, stirred from within, fortified from without, that is Gissing's true territory. This is the inner condition he understands down to the bone. It is when he gets right inside the one who feels him or herself a born outsider that Gissing is remarkable. He is often thought of as something of a socialist, or even a feminist, seeking redress for the grievances of caste, but he is in fact neither. He despised the working class, thought it composed of savages, deplored women, inferior by nature, and loathed democracy, the rule of the mob. He cared only for what he thought of as society's time-honored sacrifice of the exceptional spirit. Opposition was his party standard. In this sense, he bears favorable comparison with some of the great novelists of his time and place. Neither Hardy, James, nor Eliot had any more politics than did Gissing. They, too, were drawn to the spectacle of the individual spirit, desolated by the lockstep coldness of respectable society. Gissing was born in 1857 in Yorkshire, the son of a druggist who died young, consigning a wife and 5 children to genteel poverty. George, however, was a gifted student who won a scholarship to a college in Manchester, with the promise of another in the offing for London University. At school he did extraordinarily well, carrying off all the prizes and honors, and discovering that he was a born academic. Presumably he was set for life. But already Gissing was beset by the fatal combination of pride and insecurity that throughout his life would encourage him to self-destruct. At 18, still a student at the college, he began to prowl the streets in search of sexual adventure. Here he met and fell in love with a young prostitute named Nell Harrison. Gissing romanticized Nell and her need of him to a fare-thee-well. On the eve of graduation, he was caught stealing money for her from a fellow student. Not only was he expelled from the college, he was sent to prison for a month. Like the French lieutenant's woman, he had married himself to shame. Now he was set for life. After prison, the family packed him off to America for a year, where he wandered aimlessly, wrote his first stories, and nearly perished of the loneliness that was to become his life's companion. Back in England, he went looking for Nell Harrison, found her, and, astonishingly, married her. They came down to London, moved into lodgings, and Gissing began both his struggle to write and his accommodation to the sense of stigma that had left him, in his own eyes, beyond the pale of respectable society. The marriage, of course, turned out pure hell, and within a few years the couple had separated. This place, beyond the pale, was the one Gissing clearly needed to occupy, as he pursued it relentlessly throughout his short life. He died at 46. Not that actual circumstances didn't cooperate. Two English writers of disparate sensibility capture the situation neatly. Gissing, George Orwell tells us, was indeed up against the fog-bound, gas-lit London of the 80s, a city of drunken Puritans, where clothes, architecture, and furniture had reached their rock bottom of ugliness, and it was almost normal for a working-class family of 10 persons to inhabit a single room. Here, a bookish, over-civilized man in love with classical antiquity found himself trapped in a cold, smoky Protestant country where it was impossible to be comfortable without a thick padding of money between yourself and the outer world. On the other hand, Virginia Woolf observes, by 1884, Gissing's books had begun to sell, and he was making a living from them. Yet he insisted on feeling as though the Baker Street trains hissed their steam under his window, and the lodger downstairs blew his room out, and the landlady was insolent, and the grocer refused to send the sugar so that he had to fetch it himself, and the fog burnt his throat, and he caught cold, and never spoke to anybody for 3 weeks. Literary people had begun to seek him out. H.G. Wells insisted on becoming a friend, but Gissing continued to experience himself as poor and alone, condemned to the company, if any, of the wretched of the earth. "It is my fate," he wrote to an acquaintance as late as 1890, "to be known by the first-class people and to associate with the second class, even the third and fourth. It will always be so." It was a self-created loneliness that put him in the bind from which he could imagine no escape. To this same acquaintance he also wrote, "This solitude is killing me. I can't endure it any longer. I must resume my old search for some decent working girl who will come and live with me. I am too poor to marry an equal and cannot live alone." Sure enough, Nell Gissing died, alone in a London slum in 1888, and Gissing picked up a servant girl in the street who became his second wife and provided him with yet another disastrous marriage, this one ending in even worse degradation than had the first. Needless to say, The house was a war zone, off-limits to anyone he might want to know. The character who appears most often in Gissing's books is based on himself, the literary man of taste who has no money. Without money he cannot hope to marry well or make a home to which he can invite friends. Thus our protagonist is destined for solitariness and sexual starvation, both of which drive him into the complex circumstance that forms the plot of the novel, wherein, whether the book is set among the London poor or among the London middle class, Gissing will make a thorough exploration of both the external and internal miasma into which poverty, obscurity, and mortified senses have plunged our man. New Grub Street is the book into which he poured every kind of outsider emotion attached to this character that he had ever known or imagined. The scene is London's vast scribbling life in the 1880s. The characters are writers of all sorts, journalists, novelists, scholars, book reviewers, and hacks who act as editors to those intent on vanity press publication. The shared view is, if you write trash, you succeed. If you write authentically, you fail. God, do you fail? There is not a writer alive who will not be startled, even frightened, by Gissing's lifelike depiction of this scene. Commercially blunt publishers, nasty editors running small-minded quarterlies, literature produced by the pound and paid for by the pound, the economic evil of the royalty and advance system, the soul-destroying insecurity of writers, both marginal and successful. No one has captured this life as fully, as lucidly, as madly as Gissing has here in this extraordinary work. The major characters are Edwin Reardon, a painfully high-minded author of serious novels, Gissing's stand-in, and Jasper Milvain, an up-and-coming literary journalist with a strong sense of the marketplace. Their women are a pair of cousins, Amy and Marion Yule. Amy is bright and shallow, Marion thoughtful and sensitive. Jasper and Amy will prevail, Edwin and Marion go under. Around these four is grouped a cast of minor characters distinguished for its range of meanness and nobility and for the dazzle of its dialogue. Although the deck is stacked, sensibility will suffer, worldliness succeed. The delivery of narrative development through a wealth of conversation that is psychologically rich, intellectually probing, and invariably of an exhilarating length makes the book a joy to read. For this reader, however, Gissing's psychological brilliance comes most fully into focus when it applies itself not to starving writers or sensitive young men of no means, but to the women who, in the author's own time, began to proclaim themselves new. Almost against his will, he really didn't like them. He took a close look and saw that it was through the odd women that he could most sympathetically, that is, most realistically, express the nature of the crippling self-divide experienced by those who know themselves to be categorically unwanted. These people embodied the double bind that he had spent his life obsessing over, that of the born outsider whose own inner turmoil helps call into radical question the subversive nature of organized social experience. I first came to Gissing's work 25 years ago when a friend urged on me The Odd Women. I reread the book every 6 months for years. Great books about women in modern times had been written by men who were Gissing's contemporaries. Within 20 years, there had been Thomas Hardy's Jude the Obscure, Henry James's Portrait of a Lady, George Meredith's Diana of the Crossways. But penetrating as these novels were, Gissing's was the one that spoke most directly to me. I could see and hear the characters as if they were women and men of my own acquaintance. I knew, intimately what was tearing these people apart. What's more, I recognize myself as one of the odd women. Every 50 years from the time of the French Revolution, feminists had been described as new women, free women, liberated women. But Gissing had gotten it just right. We were the odd women. The novel is set in London in 1887. Mary Barfoot, a gentlewoman in her 50s, is running a secretarial school to prepare middle-class girls for occupations other than that of teacher or governess. Her colleague is Rhoda Nunn, 30 years old, darkly handsome, highly intelligent, uncompromising in her open scorn for what she calls the slavery of love and marriage. There isn't an argument to be made in favor of legal union for which Rhoda doesn't have an instant comeback. Against these two are set a group of friends from Rhoda's girlhood, the three Madden sisters, daughters of a country doctor whose death has left them nearly penniless and fit for nothing. All their hopes pinned on a successful marriage for the youngest, pretty Monica. Enter Edmund Widdowson and Everard Barfoot. The first, a timid clerk in his 40s, just come into a modest fortune, who picks Monica up on a Sunday afternoon in the park. The second, Mary's clever, well-to-do, strong-willed cousin, whose intellectual sparring with Rhoda, the glory of the book, becomes steadily and mutually eroticized. The story of these four is the one that Gissing tracks with skill, patience, and immense understanding. What, the book asks, are men and women to be, both for themselves and for each other? One of the couples is unschooled, unintellectual, and socially humble. The other educated, ambitious, and further up on the scale of status. But in relation to this question, all four are possessed of an innocence for which life makes no allowance. Monica will marry Widdowson only to learn what a prison sentence marriage to a narrow, frightened man can be. Rhoda will fail to marry Barfoot, who challenges her to a free union that, in the end, she has neither the trust in him nor the confidence in herself to make. All will purchase experience at the expense of becoming a cropper. To Edmund Widdowson, hungry to escape his shabby loneliness, marriage is the promise of a morally uplifting contract between a benign master and an obedient subordinate. He cannot imagine a partnership of equals. To Monica Madden, desperate to come in out of the economic cold, it is a calculated hope that some measure of comfort and security will be decently achieved. Soon enough, Widdowson is mortified by Monica's minimal assertions of independence and grows despotic. She, in turn, is horrified at finding herself a bird in a gilded cage and begins to despair. Their situation is pathos itself. She asked only to be trusted, and this, in spite of all, was beyond his power. In no woman on earth could he have put perfect confidence. He regarded them as born to perpetual pupillage, incapable of attaining maturity, imperfect beings, ever liable to be misled. Rhoda Nunn and Everard Barfoot, ambitious to occupy a world of new women and men, imagine themselves dedicated to the proposition of true partnership between the sexes, but, in the final analysis, can do no better than Monica and Widdowson. Theirs is the 2 steps forward, 1 step back journey into self-knowledge that accounts for the snail's pace at which internal change, social or emotional, progresses. Barfoot's intelligence persuades him that he seeks companionateness in marriage. For him, it must mean the mutual incitement of vigorous minds, passion. Yes, there must be passion, at all events, to begin with. But, be a woman what else she may, let her have brains and the power of using them. Intellect was his...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?